honor and challenge of trying to bring everything that we've heard today into the context of planokc. And for me, that means how and at what level are citizens and decision makers in Oklahoma going to agree on actions that are going to influence future development patterns. And let me give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about here. I'm going to start with this point, that the way a place develops physically, its development pattern, can have a big effect on aspects of quality of life that people care about. I'm then going to say that I'm then going to talk about the investments in public policies that cities can make that can influence those development patterns. And then I get to the fact that all of this is really pretty complicated, how you put all that together, so I'm going to give you an idea of how complicated it is. And then finally, I'm going to end with some technical evaluation, some of which previous speakers have already talked about, to talk about how the city of Oklahoma has been working for the last 2 or 5 years, depending upon which slide you look at, on this plan. And the work's not done, but it's now far enough along that it can provide some pretty interesting information about different development patterns and how they operate. So that's more or less the context of what I'm going to be talking about. In the course of that, I've been working for the last 20 years on about 10 different metropolitan plans that are somewhat similar to this, and have reviewed another couple dozen, and I'll try to put planokc in that context. So let me start with assumptions and issues. The first assumption is that Oklahoma City is going to grow, and all the forecasts are that it will, and that growth means demographic and socioeconomic growth, more people, more jobs and activity. If you have more people, jobs, and activity, you're going to have physical growth. You're going to need buildings and infrastructure for them. You're going to have development. If you have development, that development can come in different patterns, and if it comes in different patterns, those different patterns can have different outcomes for things that people in Oklahoma City care about. So that's my assumptions about growth, and I don't think we could get into a debate about it, but I'm solid with those. Then we get to assumptions about actions. And here's an action that all of us who are in the world of planning more or less buy into, and that is that actions now can improve the future. And a theme that I'm going to come to several times is, if I tend to drift off in jargon, or if you think I am, bring it back to your own lives, because everything's scalable. What I'm saying about how the city's trying to do stuff, just think about your own household and family, and you say, yeah, that's kind of how we do stuff too. So I think most of us believe that there are things that we can do now that are going to make things better in the future. So we're optimistic in that sense. In Oklahoma City's case, it is very clear, I think, from the previous presentations, that market forces are critical to this. But, and this but is important, that those private actions by themselves are not sufficient. There is a public role. And I may come back to that point, but I believe that very sincerely. And if there's a public role and the public's going to take action, then there's an obligation on the part of the public to understand cause and effect. You're just going to go out willy-nilly and say, well, I'm going to do this and hope for the best. You think about it, and I think some of the presentations today have been talking to you about that as well. Unfortunately, that's complicated. And it's complicated by a lot of complicated causal relationships. And it's also complicated by the fact that people have really different perspectives on the information that's presented to them. And those different perspectives cause people to look at the same problem and have really different ideas about how bad that problem is. And one has to be aware of that as you're going through this. You have to honor those perspectives. So all that leads me then to this idea that we need a public process of evaluation, and that process is planokc. So given those assumptions, given this hope for planning, I think the idea that planning can work is clearly, it's optimistic. And so, but we have this optimism, and this optimism permeates the American culture, and it really permeates all cultures. And so I think we have to grab onto that and go forward with it. So I'm starting from that optimistic point of view. And, but with that, then there's this assumption. I want to talk a little bit about the complications, because this assumption that we can know something about the future, that's true, but it's not so easy. And again, I ask you to think about your own lives. Think about whether you can predict where you will live, what job you'll be in, what car you'll be driving 5 years out. And if you think you can do that, think about when you tried that last time 5 years ago, and think about where you are now, and think about if you got even close. And if you're still good there, now expand that and try to think about not going out 5 years, but going out 35 or 40 years, and not going out just for yourself and your family, but for another couple 100,000 families, and trying to figure out where all those people are going to live in the next 35 years, including people that don't even live here right now, and some of whom aren't even born yet. So that's the job that that these regional plans are after, trying to figure that out. And these systems that we work with are really complicated. I won't bore you with this diagram, but there are a lot of factors that affect the migration, how people come here. It's affected by quality of life, by wages, by the cost of living. There are all kinds of feedbacks. As you start looking at markets, the kind of stuff that Andrew was talking about, just trying to predict the price of housing. This sheet, I'm not going to take you through it, but this sheet just shows all the variables that you would have to consider that really do have an effect on that housing price. So it's really pretty complicated. And what we do then, and I say we, I'll own up to this, as technicians, is we tend to dig into the numbers. And we go to big tables, and then we pick out some numbers that we think are important. We find other numbers that might be important. We try to look at a relationship between them. Things move around a little bit, and eventually we come to some conclusion that here it is, this is maybe the best number that we've got. And we know that though, when we do that, when we give you all those numbers, these tables, we've been told by people more savvy than us, well, look, you can't do that, you better, it's too complicated, you better use graphics so you can simplify it and explain your points better. So we technicians turn to graphics, and this one illustrates on several dimensions that are not listed for interest of simplification that Oklahoma City is something short of Paris, but better than Lubbock. So all that information tends, it's information like this that makes citizens worry. And I think with good cause. It feeds their fears that planners are crazy or deceptive or both. It gives them the idea that maybe they're cooking something up and that they've got a predetermined outcome that they want to serve up. So they think, for example, that planners in some cities, they want everybody to live in transit-oriented development that's high density. They think that planners want everybody to go give up their automobiles and go into alternative modes of transit, of transportation that include transit, but certainly include bicycle riding. And so when all those things happen, then people get worried about this. And as I am thinking about the future, and again, I encourage you to think about the future, how you think about the future, and in concept, you're really trying to make things better, and you're trying to sort out all these different issues as you do that. Now, I'm not saying that there are, of course, plenty of cases where government or private business, for example, where people in power have really strong opinions, and they try to give direction to policy. I mean, witness the U.S. Congress, for example. A quick aside, I just remembered I heard this last night. The U.S. Congress, they're finally going to change the name of the Washington Redskins. I don't know if you heard this or not, but they're going to put aside all that past history of violence and bigotry and irrationality, and from now on they're going to be known just as the Redskins. So what happens is people can selectively put together information, but what I'm going to tell you is in Oklahoma City, and I think what you've seen today, is that planokc is really about an open public debate, and that's one of the things that can rein this in, that can keep it from running away. So this has been a long process, there's a lot of information, and a lot of analysis, and the analysts really do care about getting the analysis right. And I think that applies to planokc, and that's what I want to talk about in the rest of this presentation. So the objectives and methods that I want to talk about, let me start with the big view, and in this case I'm going to go quickly because I realize that I'm covering a lot of what Russell Klaus already covered. But here's really what we're trying to do. The big picture is that we're trying to make everybody happy. And making everybody happy means that we got to think about all the impacts, positive and negative, those are costs and benefits, on everybody, on households, businesses, governments, consumers, everybody, all the people that exist now and all the people that are going to exist later, individually and in the aggregate, and so we got to do it in the short run and long run. That's a big job. And as you start to drill down on that, you say, well, let's take a look at what that means. If we're trying to make everybody better, sometimes in planning we refer to that as, well, let's make quality of life better. And you think about quality of life, and how do you get quality of life? Well, you want to have economic prosperity, because you can't have a good quality of life if you don't have the income. You want to have environmental quality, you want to have urban amenity and social well-being, and you want to, but all that has to be subject to cost of living. You can't run away with the cost on that. Now let's drill down into those three things, and you say, well, here's economic welfare, that's about jobs, job quality, job security, wages, environmental quality, water, air, etc. Urban amenity, all kinds of factors, many of which we've heard about today, transportation, housing, shopping, etc. So when you get through all that, and this, by the way, is often referred to in other places as the triple bottom line, thinking about the economy, the environment, social, and cultural. And if you dig down even further and you take a look at what regional plans are trying to do, deal with the economy, the environment, etc., pick just one of those, as I have, transportation, and now drill down on that and say, well, what do we have to do for transportation? Well, for transportation, oops, you gotta go the right way. We care about safety, we care about speed, access, mobility, how reliable it is, how convenient it is. So the point that I'm making is there are a lot of variables here that are trying to get balanced. And I come back and ask you again to think about, these balancing these multiple objectives. There are there's a lot of things that we want, and we can't have it all. And that point's been made a couple times. There are trade-offs, and we're not trying to get to the most benefit. We're not trying to get to the least cost. What we're really trying to get to is the best value. As we look at all these trade-offs, what makes sense? And I encourage you again to think about your own lives. I put an example up here, of choosing a partner. And this one is, as you choose a partner, do you want somebody that's smart? Do you want somebody that is slender? Somebody that's strong? Somebody that is authoritative? Somebody that is rich? Or someone that is stable? All of these possible characteristics. And you're trying to sort that out, and it's really hard to get all that in one package, unless, I guess, you're Prince William. And so, and you're trying to trade off all these attributes, and having too much of one attribute is a bad thing, as some of these illustrations make clear. So, in the context of Plan Oklahoma City, then, what we're doing is, over in the left-hand column is what Russell already showed you. Here are those multiple attributes. And those are the terms being used, and there are the systems that they are affecting that people care about. And we are trying to figure out whether these development patterns that are going to happen in the future are going to make those systems better or worse, and how we balance it all out. That's the trick. And so that's really what I want to talk to you about then, are the way we do that. And the way the Plan OKC is doing that is with something called scenarios. And I will now define what I mean by that. So scenario planning means that we are looking at possible futures. There are an infinite number of possible futures out there. We don't know which one is going to occur. Some are more likely than others, but there are a lot of them. And it's usually long range. We're not talking about something a year out. In this case, we're talking about planning to 2050. We are 35 years out. And in the case of metropolitan planning, it's usually about urban development. So it's about how many people, how many jobs, what kinds of buildings and neighborhoods, where are they, and how are they going to be served. Development patterns is an important part of that. And by pattern, I mean the location of growth and the buildings that accommodate it, the density of that growth, because it can be in a location, but it can be different density, and it can have a different mix of uses. So it can be all industrial, or it can be a mix of industrial and commercial, etc. Those are part of a development pattern. What is not part of a development pattern, and turns out to be very important to my fiscal analysis, that I'll come to later, is the amount of growth. The amount of growth is more or less for this project given. The expectation is that Oklahoma City will grow by roughly 50% by 2050. And the assumption is that's going to happen. And the composition of that growth is also assumed to be constant. And that has some important implications for some of the analysis that I will come back to. So here's how planokc is doing these growth scenarios. It's using a software tool called Envision Tomorrow, and just think of that as an accounting package on a computer with maps. And what happens then is that the city staff is taking all of the information that you heard today and is creating development patterns based on that. And it's got 3 that it's working with. One is called trends, and so that's saying, let's take what we have now and just go to the future. Well, I've got a slide to define that in a minute. So there are trends plus market plus efficiency, trends plus market efficiency, revitalization. And the key point here is this ties to what's been talked about before. So the work that both of the Andrews have been doing on parks and retail, et cetera, what Rick has been talking about on transit and transportation, all of that is going into the heads of people as they try to create these development patterns. The trends is kind of continuing what has happened over the past 20 years. If we keep developing the way we have, the same mix of housing, more or less the same density of housing, spreading out the same way we have in the same locations, and a decline in some areas that are already declining, and relatively low transit investment and ridership. Then the next one was trends plus market plus efficiency. This plus market is a really important part. In both cases, you'll see plus market. What Oklahoma's, this idea of growing, of trends versus then growing up or growing more dense is very common in these kinds of studies. But what's less common is focus on markets and saying, what is the market pushing us to? And if we want to change, how far can we move the market and what constraints do we have to accept? So in trends, in this scenario, they're accepting more or less the demand as Andrew outlined it. They're putting in a little bit more transit, as Rick outlined it, and they're getting housing a little closer to work and shopping. And they're getting, and as a result, it's getting more efficient. In this one, it's more or less the same thing, except there's more compact development closer in and more revitalization in areas that were declining. What that looks like on a map is this. And the best way to do this is to flick quickly through them. Here's trends, and what I'm showing you now is where the new growth goes. So think of the green as new growth, and the darker the green, the more the new growth. So in this case, you can see that there is still growth out in on the east side, both southeast and northeast, but it's pretty low density. Now, then you get to this alternative, and you start to see that the light green goes away, it gets a little bit denser, and now with this one, it's denser yet. So if I just flip through these, you kind of get a feel for these allocation patterns. The important part about this is that in all of these cases, what the planners creating this are saying is any of these patterns is not inconsistent with the market analysis on housing and retail that we have done. If it is inconsistent, then these would have to change. And maybe they will be modified, but right now, the assessment is that these are consistent. So this is where the growth goes. And now I'll just ask you to think about that. Again, take it back to your lives. This is scalable. I mean, think about what we're trying to do with this is to say, as we get these development patterns, we're going to get different results. Things are going to change. We're going to have different services that we're going to have to provide. It's going to cost a different amount of money. And what we want to do is be smart about it. So any of these could work, but they will have different cost implications. So I ask you again, come think back about your own decisions. Have you ever bought a car? Have you ever taken a vacation? Have you ever done a remodeling project where you said at the end of it, wow, that was a mistake. I wish I'd thought about that before. So, and not only are you saying that, but your spouse, your kids, your mother-in-law, and your friends are all telling you the same thing. So that's where the city is right now. They don't want to be in the position of people saying afterwards, well, why didn't you think about that? So that's what planokc is about. We're thinking about this and trying to get it right. And in the simple case of a remodel where you've done it wrong, and it means another weekend and a couple of trips to Home Depot, that's one thing. But for the city, it means 10 years of work, hundreds of millions of dollars, and just a lot of wasted public investment. So the idea is, let's get this right. So some examples of the results then. So examples of the results. And what I'm talking about now, I'm going through this pretty quickly, and I want to re-emphasize what I said before. These are interim results. The way this process works, a whole lot of work has gone into this. Andrew's park study is done. Andrew's retail study and housing study, they are done. But what is done is that analysis and the output of that analysis. What that analysis is saying is now going into these models to try to figure out, well, let's get a land use pattern that is consistent with that. And now that we've got that land use pattern, is that good or bad? Well, now we're into all those elements of planokc. How does that affect transportation? How does it affect social issues? How does it affect all these things we care about? So here are some preliminary outputs from this model that has now had this information dumped into it. And this is just a reminder that these long terms, I can't fit them on a slide, so I'm going to use shorthand S1 for scenario 1, which is trend S2, and S3 for these two different ones. So talk first about the physical impacts. So you do these patterns down and stuff happens. What kind of stuff happens? Well, first of all, developed acres. There's a reminder on the right-hand side what these three patterns are. And this is showing how many acres get developed under these different patterns. And the answer is that in S3, the denser one, there are 80,000 fewer acres developed. Now, for those of you that don't do land use planning on a daily basis, 80,000 acres, maybe that means something, maybe it doesn't. But that's 125 square miles. You heard that Oklahoma City was 600 square miles. So that's adding roughly another quarter to Oklahoma City. That's an area that's 11 miles by 11 miles. And that is how much extra acres get developed, not how much total acres get developed. So that's a lot of land that gets developed if we stay ahead with the trend. It may be the right thing to do, that may be the pattern you want, but you need to know what it is that's happening there. That pattern can create impervious surfaces. Now, that developed land, a lot of it is still green because there's a house on an acre, and the house only takes up a couple thousand square feet. But that house does have an impervious surface. The impervious surface goes up also. That means more runoff. That means more storm drainage. And that fits into the fiscal impact. You get different amounts of redevelopment. A reminder of what these scenarios are, the three. And you can see that in the third one, where you're doing more revitalization in the downtown, you obviously get more redevelopment of housing in the downtown. In the first alternative, you don't get much revitalization at all because the trend is for the exodus from the downtown. In the other, you now have 17,000 new units, which is 30 times more than in the first one. And the jobs come to the downtown also. As you push your infrastructure investments and your policy into centralized area, you get that shift. And I want to be really clear here. I'm not making a normative judgment. I'm describing what happens under these alternatives. What you choose is a discussion that is left to happen, and there are any number of possibilities, including many that we haven't even talked about here. Road miles is different. Not surprisingly, as you extend out, you have to, and are not using your existing infrastructure, you have to expand your road miles. The difference here is a couple thousand more road miles in one scenario than another. And Andrew talked about walking and walking scores. This is how the scores work. Not much difference between two of the alternatives, but the third one does a little bit better. There are many more slides like this that I could give you. You will see them more as the process continues, but I want to turn now briefly to fiscal impacts. Because the way we think about this as economists is, well, there are trade-offs. You can show me all this stuff and tell me we're going to have more roads. Well, it's going to be more friendly to walk. What are the implications for the city? How much more is that going to cost the city? That's the job that we got. And I'm going to give you, we're not done with it yet, but I'm going to give you some ideas of what we're coming into. First, very quickly, where are we on methods? I want to make a distinction between doing fiscal impacts and doing what I'll call a full benefit cost analysis. In a full benefit cost analysis, we're looking at everything good and bad that's happening. In a fiscal analysis, we're just looking at what happens with the city itself. Is the city getting more revenue and more costs? Are the revenues greater than the costs or not? That's important. It's really important because it sometimes gets confused. And the city can, for example, and I think Andrew on parks kind of gave an example of this. A city can improve its fiscal position by getting rid of certain services and say, well, we're just not going to provide parks anymore. Okay, that's better for the city if all you care about is its net revenues, perhaps. But what happens now to the citizens? Well, either they don't have the parks, or they start providing their own private parks. And are they really, the homeowner associations, are they really scaled up to do that? So this issue is really quite important. Capital and operating is important. This is another one that you'll get personally if you think about it. When you think about buying a new or used car, or trying to get, whether you're going to put a new roof on it. Well, maybe I can get another few years out of that roof. And if you defer the maintenance long enough, then you're going to have bigger problems. And if you buy a better car to begin with, you're going to be able to defer the maintenance longer. So there's always this trade-off between spending money now and getting good stuff, or spending money later or getting cheaper stuff, and then increasing your operating costs. So we have to pay attention to that. We're not just talking about capital. We're trying to estimate what the operating costs are also. So the steps are, we get the growth scenarios, we do a fiscal analysis, and then we do some estimation. The challenges are substantial, and a couple here very quickly, that we have to evaluate the pattern of growth, not the amount or composition. I talked to you about that before. But if we are to assume, as the scenarios do, that more or less the same people are coming here, then if they're the same people, they're in the same families, they've got the same jobs, they've got the same income, they've got the same spending patterns, and they can pay about the same for taxes, and they're going to live in the same type of houses. So those things don't change. The type of houses, some a little bit on the type of houses. And because of that, then, we have to be careful to try to isolate what happens with the change in pattern rather than just the arbitrarily changing composition. Some bad studies have been done where things got really rosy because you just assumed that people had a whole lot more income. Well, great. We have to keep the level of service constant. This ties to a point that Andrew made about the housing. Where people want security, if we put people in a scenario into denser housing, and because of that, for whatever reason, we find out that we can't get police protection there at the same rate that we did before, and the level of service goes down, we have to try to accommodate that. We either have to make the level of service constant, or we have to acknowledge that we haven't. There are a bunch of other issues. Last one I'm going to jump to 4, time horizon. Remember, I'm talking to you about this scenario where we're going out to 2050. Well, obviously, we're not going to get, the way we're going to get to 2050 is by getting from 2013 to 2014 to 2015, et cetera. So growth is going to be incremental. That's too hard to model, so what we typically do is we just assume that everything's there overnight. So here we are, we finish this tonight, you go out and have a drink, you go to bed, and tomorrow morning, it's 50% bigger in Oklahoma City. What kind of infrastructure would we have to put in to have accommodated that and keep level of service constant? So with that, just a quick thing to show you that a big part of your budget, your operating budget, is on police and fire. And then 4 examples. One way to, and a point I want to make here is that when we do these forecasts, we've got different ways of doing it. Some things grow based on general growth, and your general services do that. They're not really based on location. You're not going to have a new city council. You're not going to have, your administration isn't going to change just because growth locates over here or over there. And because of that, when we start looking at those things like facility management and administration, the costs across alternative are really quite similar. Some things are affected by not just population and employment growth, but by the amount of travel. And the amount of travel can change based on what the pattern is. Here was one where we looked at traffic management, and we got really pretty small differences there based on the vehicle hours traveled. Where you start getting bigger differences is when you start looking at cost of new roads. I showed you this slide earlier, where you can see the different number of road miles from the dense scenario to the less dense scenario, 2,400 different road miles. That's a big difference in lane miles, and a rough estimate is about $1 million a mile. So that means there's a difference in this development pattern of about $2.4 billion. Now, 2.4, skip the 0.4, even skip the 2. It might be it's 1, maybe it's 4, but it's a big number. It's in the billions. And moreover, the maintenance cost is different. Now that you have all that additional road miles, you have to maintain it, and that can add to an additional 1 to 5% per year. Conservatively, we put in 1%, an additional $24 million a year. Police is yet a different method of looking at things. Police costs are based on the number of calls that they get. That's a function of population, employment. We did some analysis to show that it was partially affected by income and the mix of uses. And then we do maps like this that show that, I won't even try to explain, don't even try to understand. The message for you is we've done maps. And what it's showing is that the colored areas on the outside is where the call times are getting, where the calls are going up, because that's where the growth is going. So those additional calls are going to have additional expenditures. It comes across more easily with fire, where we do not only calls, but the response time. So now you're looking at the number of calls you're getting, but the response time, which also includes where you're located relative to fire stations and how well connected the streets are. And in that case, we get a map that looks like this, where the red, and the way this will go, it's not done yet, but this is the kind of map that will go to your fire department that will look at this and say, wow, I can see where all my response times are going to get really high if growth goes the way you said it is. This is just for trend, so we have 3 of these maps for the other alternatives. So here's where I need to put my fire stations, and I got to put different fire stations for different alternatives, and that's going to cost a different amount of money. And once we get that information, then we'll tell you how much difference that's going to cost. So that's just an overview and a taste of the kind of analysis that is happening now. And at the beginning, Russell told you where this thing is going. There's the consultant work, some of this detailed work is supposed to be done in December and January, and then that work comes out to a bunch of public forums where you get to look at it, vet it, and perhaps even talk about different alternatives, have people check those out, and hopefully a decision then in spring on which of these development patterns makes the most sense. There's a lot of technical information here. I think the really important point is that the relative importance of this information is not something that we technicians can make a decision on. That is a public decision. Your decision makers help you make it, but the public helps the decision makers make it. What matters to you? Is it schools that matter? Is it roads that matter? Is it this development pattern or that? You'll have time in that conversation, and that's what planokc is supposed to help you with. Thank you.